Well, hello, everyone. Professor Barry here. And we're going to continue on in our journey. Let me kind of actually back out of here. We're going to continue on in our journey on stratification. 2 weeks ago, social class stratification. Some things we kind of explored are, what is stratification and how do we define it? How do we think about it? Start to get into space about thinking about ideologies or beliefs about how the world operates, kind of the ideology of the American dream. Different aspects of like, what's going on in the structure of society, structural social mobility. So that was all 2 weeks ago. Then last week, racial stratification, started like linking together privilege and domination. Like, how do we think about the relationship between those two things? Issues of racial inequality, racial privileging, within over historical time period, contemporary biological conceptions of race, social construction of race. And now we move into gender. And it's like kind of like the third part of usually when you unpackage stratification, it's race, class, and gender is what we kind of examine. Not that there's not other issues of inequality to address or privilege, but these are the three kind of core areas to kind of get at. And I also got to think about it as being intersectional. So race, class, and gender are interactive. Not everyone of a certain class has the same privilege or is subordinated or is restricted in the same way. Same with race and gender. So it's important to keep that intersectional nature in mind. We're going to use some similar concepts as before, but we're going to apply them to gender and gender stratification. This is like the last like core area of the class. And then it's all these micro areas that we're going to kind of get into, and maybe kind of maybe have a little bit different format for the remainder of the term. So here's some images to kind of get thinking about gender. We have Harry Styles, a celebrity dressing in, what would be identified as women's clothes. This was women's clothes. This was on the cover of Vogue magazine, maybe in 2021, 2022. Caused a lot of public discussion about gender nonconformity. We have this T-shirt here. I bring it up because I remember I was in the neighborhood one time, walking home or riding my bike or something, and these young boys, I don't know, sixth grade maybe, I imagine teenagers or middle school, and one kid had a shirt on, said "Virginity sucks," and I was like, wow, it's super interesting. Like thinking about dramaturgy. Who's he wearing this shirt for? Who's his audience? What's he trying to establish? Ideas of masculinity become in this space. Think about status and dramaturgical elements. Gender is something we do. Sexual double standard, maybe even with virginity sucks, that if a male wears a shirt versus a female, different evaluations and judgments of the same thing. Batman and Robin, we'll kind of talk about the concept called hyper-masculinity that comes up when we think about like action figures and sort of the male body, presentation of the male body in contemporary culture over time. And then the bottom right here is just sort of recognizing more conversations today about gender fluidity or understanding that gender is more complex than a binary. That's much more part of contemporary landscape discussion. So let's kind of define terms, ideas. Sex is biological, anatomical, biological, physiological. Gender is social, cultural. So it gets us into the social construct as gender. So historical, cultural, social, those are gender. Sex roles, the roles that are associated with a biological sex. And then gender roles. So kind of the importance of making that distinction. There's very few things that are actual sex roles. Like breastfeeding is something that males do not lactate. Some males that's not a role that they can take on. They can't carry a child in terms of during a pregnancy. So that's a sex role. Once we start getting to other things like who's going to be the leader of the home or who's going to be the caretaker of the kids, now we're getting into gender. So I think that distinction is important to make. So there may be sort of kind of a claim sometimes that, well, no, it's a sex role that men are supposed to or females are just supposed to. And sociologists, anthropologists are very critical of that view because it doesn't account for the variability across cultures and time and place. Cisgender, the sex that a person is assigned at birth aligns with their gender identity. To be a cisgender male, anatomically male, also identify with male. Transgender, an individual whose gender does not match with their sex assigned at birth. So we have more discussions about understanding and unpacking gender and sexuality today, and of course, part of the culture wars as well, about laws and resources and different aspects within culture and society itself. Yeah, and recognition non-binary. So this idea that, oh, you're either male or female, like, okay, there's kind of been a critique of that model. But we'll talk a little bit later on just sort of about some historical perspective, like the development of an idea of heterosexuality and homosexuality, like where that came from. It's like, hey, gender queer, kind of challenging gender norms and expectations. The identity within gender queer space, much more dynamic, less restrictive, much more about challenging the dominant kind of gender view and ideals. Gender fluidity, recognizing that gender varies across time and place, is an important part too. And then you kind of get into like this whole body. Judith Butler, who's a researcher, academic, 1970s, 80s and on, took Goffman's idea of dramaturgy, applied it to gender, talked like a whole academic work on this idea of doing gender. Gender is something that we practice, it's that we do, and to kind of think about it in that regard. And you could do a whole academic course in just the idea of doing gender. And then finally, masculinity and masculinities versus femininity and femininities is recognizing that there's not one form of masculinity, that it changes based on race, based on class, based on region of the country. So there's multiple masculinities. So this becomes the intersectional nature, race, class, gender being intersectional. So I don't know, some like dramaturgical kind of components, some gender roles, these representations trying to demonstrate some of those concepts that we mentioned. Okay, so the idea of masculine and feminine, right? This is going to be a cultural thing. How is this being defined? What is masculine? What are the traits that are associated with masculinity? Cultural definitions that are things that are traits that are appropriate. Okay, that's going to be difficult, right? Already, because I have to get into, well, appropriate for whom and under what context. Like that's not straightforward about it's appropriate. Well, from a dominant culture viewpoint, and that becomes a little bit more sociological now. Traits that the dominant culture identifies as being associated with male or female. Researchers have investigated the different chemical effects on the testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone. And argue, advocate, or recognize that, man, there's been an overplay that biology is determining our characteristics, our behavior, who we are. There's been too much focus historically on the biological, and the social cultural environment is shaping the biological. It's nature and nurture, but historically too much has been placed on the nature side, and there's much more stuff going on the nurture side. I put a question mark here because this person writing in psychology today, it's like, okay, yeah, sociology would see this a little bit differently, a different perspective. The cultural expectations came about naturally. So cultural expectations of masculinity and femininity. So when this author says came about naturally due to the size and strength of men and women, I don't think there's anything natural. Like nothing happens because it's natural to do that. There may have been some reason, some rationale. But that is culture. Once you start using the word natural, it implies that it was inevitable, that there wasn't the subjective decisions going on in that process. I think this is kind of interesting. Like this is a more contemporary model. I'll show you another one from the 1970s in a minute, but think about, or to sort of recognize, here's the things that we associate with masculinity: rational, competitive, analytical; feminine side, collaborative, emotional, passionate, creative. It's not that males are masculine, females feminine, right? We all have some combination of traits associated with both. There may be a tendency for males to be more masculine, females to be more feminine. That's probably going to change based on region of the country, occupational status, social class position, all these different kind of factors going on there. Like one kind of interesting thing to make a comparison to see how fluid sometimes these traits are is you look at masculinity, males, and if you could go back and do a survey and say, okay, of these characteristics, survey 1,000 males across different demographics, class, and race, and ask them, okay, which of these traits do you associate most with? Say that males are going to be, a certain range on the scale of masculinity and femininity, let's just say here in 1950. Maybe today, maybe a little bit more to the right. Maybe, I don't know how far, maybe a little bit. Then ask women females that same question in 1950 versus today or different time periods. I think females in the 1950s, middle class females, white females, even regardless of race, going to see here, it's going to be over here somewhere. I think middle class is going to be over here, working class may be over here somewhere. But compared to today, that females have probably developed a lot more masculine characteristics or support masculine characteristics because of involvement in things like business and industry, cultural values towards greater economic and social independence. So I guess trying to demonstrate here is that the acquisition of these traits varies across time and place. This is not biological kind of rooted kind of things. So this is 1970s. It's kind of like shocking now, I think, in a lot of ways. When I did my first master's degree in speech comm, my study was looking at, I interviewed people, conversations which there was a conflict, and was looking at how do males and females respond differently based on the conflict and a couple of different variables in the conflict. And I used a particular scale to identify masculinity and femininity, degrees of masculinity and femininity, to see if, okay, does degree of masculinity and femininity influence which type of style people use in responding to conflict? Well, that was 1980, that was 1991 when I did that academic work and that research. And this was the common scale that was used in that time period. And I look back on it now and go, wow, that's pretty disturbing now. At the time, it was institutionalized as a norm, thinking, okay, social construction of reality, right? That we could be participating in something, working through the world, not even realizing in some sort of way the strange and the familiar, like we should be asking questions about this stuff. And I imagine people were, but I wasn't involved in those discussions. I wasn't that far along in my academic kind of work. But look at the 1974, look what's associated with masculine, analytical, athletic, competitive. Some of those are the same: dominant, independent, make decisions easily, self-reliant, self-sufficient. I mean, I wonder, like, why is that masculine and not feminine? I mean, that's never been intuitive to me, like why. It seems pretty arbitrary. But then you kind of hear the feminine items: childlike, does not use harsh language, gullible, flatterable, soft-spoken. So, I mean, we look at this today and go, problem. Most people look at this today and go, problem. What's going on? Like, this is faulty. Again, kind of demonstrating that ideas of masculinity, we're going to get into culture and society and all kinds of different things with that. Okay, so that's laying some framework in gender and sexuality, or gender and masculinity, femininity. Now let's kind of move to looking at some different historical, just like some data points. 1970, 2021, more women are in college today, graduating different degrees, law school, medical school, women with a bachelor's degree versus men, 8% in ages. So a big fundamental shift. This is one reason why more focus on masculine traits. Also, I mentioned before, maybe or not, but female voices are dropping in tone around the world, getting deeper. There's been that's been noticed and recorded in a lot of different countries around the world. So part of this sort of is linked up to these things like greater autonomy, independence, and also moving into fields where the association that a deeper voice is associated with greater authority and commanding that authority. Gender wage gap, it's declined over the years. There's a whole thing we can unpack about thinking about gender wage, which we won't do, but just another thing to kind of consider. If we look at certain areas like Fortune 500 companies, top economically profitable companies, largest companies, the CEO, who's the chief executive officer, that in 2002, 7 of the 500, there was a female in office as a chief executive officer. Now it's 74 out of 500. So change, movement towards more females leading businesses and industry. Intersectionality, always important to remember too. So we could go back here with the CEO. It's like, okay, what's the racial background? We could look at that. So not only about being female, but a female of color and being a CEO, the likelihood and odds of that as well. So here's sort of, we could look at sort of roles within institutions and that intersectional nature, that entry-level positions, white men, white women, men of color, women of color, just sort of what's their relative number, percent within the institution itself. As moving up the hierarchy tends to become more and more dominated by white males. And what goes on, the decrease in women of color, decrease in white women as well. So just something to think about too is how does it move across an institution as well. 1 in 3 lawyers are women today. Big change. If we can kind of go back, look through time, 1960s, I mean, very few percentage-wise of lawyers who are women. Now in a lot of law programs around the United States, there's more women in law programs than males. At mid-career, when earnings peak, the top 10% of females lawyers earn more than $300,000. Top 10% of male lawyers earn more than $500,000. This becomes that gender disparity, or looking at the gender wage gap. I mean, I got to unpack that a little bit and ask questions about, well, what area of law are people practicing in? And there may be some social, cultural dimensions that are influencing that as well. So it's not that people are working in the same industry, same institutions, same job, that they're getting paid this difference. It's more about, okay, they're both lawyers, maybe working in different industries, but there is a gap there going on in terms of overall what females make and what males make. This is, I thought, kind of interesting, just looking at within like law enforcement. 17% of law enforcement officers are female, 83% male. Age demographic, racial demographic, annual pay. So it's pretty meritable in terms of within law enforcement, women earn about what men earn. I'm not sure how do you account for the 4%. But the question here, it's just kind of interesting to look at stratification and further moving up the hierarchy within law enforcement, the more likely it's going to be dominated by males. And then females are going to hold fewer and fewer offices of up the hierarchy. And there could be a lot of different reasons, micro level, individual decision-making, but those are shaped by social, cultural things as well. Could be institutional, could be opportunities that are provided, it could be discrimination, it could be a lot of different things that are operating in that space. Women who make up Congress. I mean, if you're either a House member or a senator, going back to 1917, the number of females, what is that, 1 maybe? Now, sort of the number of overall number of females who are at the House level. So yeah, growth and change and movement. And to see different political differences in terms of Republicans and Democrats and number of women. If we go to the Senate, 100 senators, 25% are female. Look, this is 1980s and on, which has really been the change. Probably the feminist movement in the 1970s having an influence on that in significant ways. Look at leadership. We have yet to have a female president in the United States. Other countries, it's not uncommon. You go through a list. Look at who are within the seats of government. Kind of go back to here in terms of the Senate, 27%, maybe it's Senate and House. Different nations where women have been leaders. Kamala Harris, first vice president, female. So differences. So if you look back in stratification, think about, okay, our principles of stratification, got to go from the micro to the macro level. So where do women end up and men end up in terms of income, occupation, and all these different other factors? Part of it could be, gender biases, what people learn, what they develop, what they're exposed to. Could be like there's barriers that are there that are more socialization that are influencing outcome. There could be certain consequences of pursuing certain fields or disciplines or areas. So more explicit barriers, certain things that are implied. Could be individual, social, cultural. So a lot of different things to address versus thinking only structural level things. All right, the next topic, think about factors related to self-determinism, just some things thinking about that relationship between individuals and society. Different people make different choices. Self-determinism is trying to understand choice making. Not everybody has the same choices available to them, and not everybody is supported or criticized for making the choices they make. So thinking about, I was talking with my class today about social stratification, about being a car on a roadway. And if you're in a, if we're all on the roadway of life, we're in a car, a vehicle, let's say, but we're all in different kinds of vehicles that get different gas mileage, that go different speeds. We have different number of passengers in our vehicle. We could be on different roadways. So self-determination is saying, okay, we're all traveling, the individual, we're making decisions, but we're making decisions that are being influenced by the larger context in which we live in. And that could be a social context, historical context, different kind of things. So one concept to think about is linguistic sexism, or language, how language and ideas of language can reinforce gender inequality. It could be very patriarchal, favoring a male-dominated view. This is like they're called Richard Scary books or children's literature, past and present. So beautiful screaming lady, this was in the past, and changing that to cat in danger. Like you can think it's like, okay, that's a small little thing. And in some ways, well, it's a small little thing, the pretty attendant versus the flight attendant. But think about here, like socialization and the power of socialization, right? Kids are reading these books. They don't have any concept understanding of gender and things like that. They're reading these books, they're seeing these images and these ideas. It's just one element of many within a culture that are shaping their ideas of gender. So it's not like we're critiquing Richard Scarry because it's just that one thing, right? It's more about an expression of culture and society itself at large. A lot more conversations today about, within libraries, educators, K through 12, going through their education, being aware of children's literature and issues of representation, addressing gender, race, ability status, different areas. And in some communities, this becomes controversial, becomes part of the culture war. I would kind of advocate or provide a perspective. I think, books, libraries within schools and institutions are trying to have representations that represent their student population. And that's going to increase diversity of representation. Think about toys is kind of an interesting thing, like what's shaping our ideas about gender. Usually like toys or popular culture, there's certain things like passiveness, nurturance, emotion associated with femininity, masculinity, power, agency, control, aggression. Female action figures, their narratives are different in terms of advertising and how they're referred to. Physical appearance, fantasy, more trivial, supportive of certain stereotypes, emotional, social, etc. Male narratives, more aggressive, more linked to power, force, science, technology, stereotypic ideas of masculinity. So, the toys that we see and play with and engage with, right? There's sort of a gender component of that. I think it's kind of interesting if you look back the history of advertising and gender and advertising, super fascinating to kind of go there. This is one kind of article from the Atlantic Monthly looking at 1970s that versus how things changed over time. So 1970s feminist movement, there's consumerism has happened at a different level than before. There's some more less gender segregation in terms of certain toys and playing with them. Here you have a female, a girl playing with construction set, a boy opening up a refrigerator, boys and girls both playing with Legos. Look what I built. I think today probably get something like this, right? The pink and blue. It's like, whoa, man, it's Target, Walmart, whatever it may be. That pink and blue kind of aisle is really a contemporary. That doesn't start until the 1990s, let's say. That's a relatively recent phenomena. There was a boy aisle and a girl aisle before, but not like this. This is fundamentally a different kind of thing. That gender segregation and marking that gender boundary is much more, I don't know, in your face or dynamic or powerful today. There's been critique of that in recent years, critiquing Target, critiquing other stores, saying, okay, Toys R Us, like, okay, what, even in the search engine, boys' toys, girls' toys, it's like it's reinforcing that gender segregation. So just have like age, right? Put age there, and toys are able to pop up in that. So there's been some response from institutions to address this gender segregation. Target is trying to move away from the way they, this kind of model. I think they still run into some challenges, so marketing and advertising, there's some things going on there. In my pop culture class, we do a unit on gender and food advertisements, which is fascinating, I think. yeah, these are different associations with food and masculinity and sexuality. And it's like, wow, it's really interesting that that finds a way in food and marketing and advertising. Um, think yogurt and health and nutrition, femininity, associated with the female body. These real toxic kind of things going on here too, for both males and for females. Ideas of masculinity, Evan Williams, the longer you wait, the better it gets. I mean, it's really devaluing, dehumanizing, demeaning to both men and women, to males and females. Say toxic ideas of masculinity and femininity. Interesting if you look over time, like things like, Carhartt is an interesting example. I mean, really durable clothes, and they got a long history going back to 1800s, I believe, maybe early 1900s, associated with working class, durable clothing, and really moved into, I'd say, like this real more masculine space in recent years. This is more contemporary, probably within the last 10 years of really in the imagery of much more of a masculine ideals within the product itself. A student in a previous class, my pop culture class, had this image, and I thought, well, that's pretty powerful. I think this was from, I'm not sure what the year was. I'm going to say 1970s, 1980s, female officer. So today, more contemporary, just those masculine attributes that are there for within women advertising and marketing in this space. It's interesting to see a shift across time in terms of promotional marketing material for those who are trying to, for recruits and for recruitments. It'd be interesting as a study to be able to compare over time period representations and how they changed over time, that kind of thing. All right, social construction of sexuality. So I'm not going to show this video, but you can look it up. It's called Prickly Subject. It's a woman talking about shaving and how it's arbitrary, and she doesn't do it anymore because her body's beautiful and she doesn't need to shave. January, so a month where some people who want to, like, they're decided, it's a time to celebrate not shaving, to push up against that dominant cultural idea of femininity and feminine beauty, and to not shave. So gender is a social construct. We're getting to like double standards of gender, where males and females may behave in a similar way, different judgment, different evaluation of that. One guy, multiple women, different response, different reaction versus the other way around. This was from an advertisement in Rolling Stone magazine, probably 30 years ago. And I was like, when I first saw it, I was first like just kind of didn't know what to make of it, but just became this great example of a sexual double standard. This kid is probably 12, 13, 14 years old, female, early 20s, mid 20s, something like that. I'm not sure. But it's just so, I mean, Rolling Stone was comfortable enough to have this as an advertisement within their magazine. I mean, if we flip that, put a female as the 13, 14, 15-year-old and the male being 25, 26, 27, there'd be, that would be incredibly controversial, problematic. I think it's problematic in this regard as well, but that's kind of part of the problem, is we don't see it as problematic. Hyper-masculinity, a concept that we use to kind of talk about the male body becoming, like in representation, becoming bigger, 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 bigger. There was a documentary called Bigger, Stronger, Faster, kind of like that kind of gets into this space a little bit. One way of looking at the development of the bigger body, it's not like it's brand new. Go to Charles Atlas back in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s. It's like the making the body bigger and more muscular. Actually, kind of go back in time. There's a whole kind of cool history about with industrialization, and the development of white collar work, of working in business and industry and working in kind of management jobs, that males were losing their physical kind of domination, their physical self. And there was this effort at that point in time. Teddy Roosevelt was full on behind this, President Roosevelt, like, man, all these programs to get males to become more masculine. So it's nothing new, but the hyper masculine is new. So this is G.I. Joe 1960s back here. And then something happened 1990s. He actually make him life-size 12-inch biceps back here, make him life-size, got 26-inch biceps. Mark McGuire was a baseball player for, I can't remember what team, but he was like steroid. I mean, he got busted for using steroids, big home run hitter. But we look at that, okay, man, why G.I. Joe changed, went from like this one figure to this figure, Superman become bigger. So how do you explain that idea? One way, it's like within academic circles, at least, explaining hyper masculinity is that feminist movement of the 1970s challenging kind of masculine ideals, men's place in society. Women are entering the workforce, entering education. Male privilege is being challenged. If you go back to social stratification, economies moving to a different economy, away from manufacturing and labor to service-oriented jobs, less kind of masculine defining work and occupations. There's kind of a crisis of masculinity, so to speak. And wages are going down. Men can't be the sole provider anymore, or fewer men can do that. So in response to all that, the body is a way to demonstrate power, authority, or position. So that's how you explain the rise of the hyper-masculine body. Social construction of gender. Another way of getting at that is this looking about the construction of sexuality. And out of this kind of an interesting book called History of Sex by Kate Lister, super fascinating. This kind of captures the idea humans are only creature that stigmatize, punish, and create shame around sexual desires. So then we're going to think about, oh, what are the historical attitudes and ideas about gender and sexuality? Why do they change? Where do they come from? Where does heteronormativity, when does that start? How does it get embedded in the language that we use and language shaping our attitudes and ideas? Like the double standard that's there. I mean, she unpacks a lot of interesting history. Look at like the idea of heterosexuality as a term, as an idea, homosexuality as a term, as an idea. And these are concepts, these are social constructs. I thought this was kind of interesting that few people in interviewing this particular person talking about sexual orientation, sexual identity, said that few people would even think or bat an eye at the rise of the homosexual. Like, when did that happen? But most people don't think about, well, heterosexuality was also created too. And that kind of stops people for a while to think about, the dominant group and the dominant culture was also a constructed group as well. Dave Halperin, the queer theorist, says sex has no history. Sexuality is a cultural production. It does have a history. So sex, no history. We're just focused on behavior. But if you look at sexuality, is like, that's the expression, right? That's the expression. And that's going to get us into culture and social kind of forces in a way. So ideas of instincts imply like natural, the way it is. That's the way part of the animal world. Humans are animals, therefore we are this way. So that removes culture and social forces. That to understand sexuality, we're going to have to get into culture and social forces that are in there. Okay, I got some other things I'm going to talk about. I'm going to kind of bypass this. I think it's important to recognize in 1973, the American Psychiatric Association finally declared that homosexuality was no longer a diagnosable mental health disorder. So in 74, the manual that clinicians use for making diagnoses did no longer have homosexuality as a disorder. It's constructed, right? So we get this social construction. Alfred Kinsey, who is like the lab coat scientist doing work in sex research in the 1950s, this book called Sexual Behavior, I think it was volume 1, volume 2 for the male, volume 1, volume 2 for the female, kind of brought to the public his empirical investigation of human sexual behavior. Never been done before. So he was an entomologist by trade. His background was in the study of sexual behavior of gall wasps. That was his study. And then he said, let's look at the human sexual behavior without any, let's say, preconceived notions of or any moral or value judgments. One thing that was concerned that created a lot of controversy is that through his investigation, he identified that there is no like binary, even back in the day when he was doing his work, that while there are some people that are exclusively heterosexual, some exclusively homosexual, there's a lot of range going on in between, and social and cultural forces shape how that range gets expressed. We're at a different place today than we were years ago. We think about same-sex relationships. 2015 was the first year Supreme Court supported same-sex marriages. We look around the world and what's changed around the world. So attitudes have changed regarding same-sex relations. This is a survey. If you had a child who was gay or lesbian or identified as gay or lesbian, what would your reaction be? And the change over time is pretty astonishing. Culture is moving pretty fast over that particular time period. We look at LGBTQ identifying individual adults by generation, super fascinating here. Like, okay, how do we understand this more and more people identifying being a member of the LGBTQ community identity, and well, more support, more allowance. I mean, how do we think about culture? How do we think the influence of culture in that space? Different concept idea, but paid maternity leave. I just want to mention it, family medical leave. The United States is the only industrialized country, economically developed country, that does not have paid maternity leave. I look at all these different countries around the world, the paid maternity leave, it's pretty significant, raises some kind of questions. Last thing to kind of mention, this is kind of a side story a little bit, but so this was in Battle Creek, Michigan, where a lot of food was produced, a lot of breakfast cereals. This was part of the Seventh-day Adventist religious tradition. Kellogg came from that tradition. And like post-cereal, Sylvester Graham, he was a moral reformer, 1900s, late 1800s. There was this sanitarium where wealthy people predominantly would go to, wealthy white people would go to the sanitarium for kind of like a moral, spiritual, physical cleansing. And food and diet were an important part. There was a belief this time period that if this kind of gets into eugenics a little bit, eugenics, the idea that there are good genes in society, trying to promote like a better society through promoting good genes. There's definitely scientific racism going on in that space. There's white supremacy operating about how do we increase the better the race, the white race. So there's a lot of white supremacy in this space. That's kind of connected to this idea of food as well. I don't want to go too far in that direction, but I bring this up because there was a belief, social construction of reality, and Thomas theorem, right? So Thomas theorem, if you believe it to be true, it's real in its consequences. Construction of reality, focus on how we define and think about things. There was a belief for a period of time that if individuals, if they had sexual encounters too frequently, and without being in the confines of, or if they were not in a marital relationship, that could lead to heart attacks, cardiac arrest, blindness, mental health problems, insanity, like all these different kind of things. So that was a belief going on at the time. And even in marital relationships, there was some doctors, physicians were advocating that if individuals were having sexual intercourse with their spouse, but they were not trying to procreate, they were doing it for sexual pleasure, that they were to stop, before achieving orgasm, to stop before achieving orgasm, and to decrease their sexual energy, they needed to do something. And one resolution, but taking a cold shower was recommended. Other thing was eating bland food. There was a belief that eating hot and spicy foods could lead to sexual excitability, and that bland foods would help control sexual urges. So Kellogg and Sylvester Graham, Graham flour, the Graham cracker, developing products that were intended to, in part, live a more moral life, but also to address issues of sexuality and sexual behavior. Anyway, fascinating. All right. Hope you're doing well. Have a great rest of your week. And until next time.